A second moon rose above the treetops, flickering like a dying bulb. It was subtle at first, a pale shimmer barely distinguishable from the mist curling between the pines. We had set up camp in the southern loop, Site 12, where the gravel pads were neatly lined and the numbered posts stood like markers in a miniature city of trees. The sun had long since surrendered behind the western ridge, leaving a muted indigo sky that deepened into black in patches between branches. Our tents smelled faintly of damp nylon and pine resin, mingling with the lingering smoke of the fire we'd abandoned in favor of cooling embers. At first, everything was ordinary. Crickets trilled in regular pulses, a distant owl called once, and our own breathing sounded too loud in the still night. Lena stirred some coals with a stick, trying to coax a few more embers, but the fire had given up. Mark leaned back on the log bench, sipping lukewarm water from a thermos, and I watched shadows stretch and collapse between the trees, silhouettes long and dark, moving with the soft sway of the wind. That's when I noticed it, a pinprick of light above the ridge. I squinted through the skeletal branches, expecting a faint star, but no, it was larger, round, impossibly near the horizon. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked, pointing. Lena followed my gesture, brows furrowed. "Looks like a moon. Must be clouds tricking your eyes," Mark said, not taking his gaze from the distant tree line. But his voice lacked conviction. It didn't take long to realize he was wrong. The light grew, pale silver and slightly distorted, as if it weren't quite a sphere. Then it blinked, just once, and in that blink, I could have sworn the trees near the horizon bent toward it for a heartbeat, their tops dipping unnaturally before snapping back. "It's flickering," Lena said, voice tight. "Like a bulb." I swallowed hard. "That's not natural." Mark laughed, though it came out forced. "It's probably just atmospheric distortion. Moonlight through thin clouds. We've all seen that before. But we hadn't. Not like this." The second moon continued to rise, and the flickering became erratic, sometimes fast, like a strobe, sometimes fading almost completely before returning. The effect wasn't subtle. It cast shadows that didn't line up, shapes that stretched and shrank in ways that defied logic. I noticed one of our chairs seemed to elongate slightly when the light pulsed, its legs lengthening across the gravel pad before returning to normal. Lena's jacket fluttered as though caught in a breeze that wasn't there. A rustling came from beyond the fire ring. Not the predictable snap of a pine branch underfoot, but something heavier, deliberate. I turned, expecting to see a deer or raccoon, but the shadows were empty. Yet I could feel the gaze, weightless but insistent, settling on me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Lena nodded, pressing herself back against the tent. "It's like someone's out there, watching." Mark's hand tightened around the thermos. "Probably another camper." I shook my head. Too quiet. No voices. No lanterns. Nothing. The second moon pulsed again, brighter this time, and I could see it ripple through the forest floor. The fallen leaves glimmered faintly as though each one had a wet sheen I hadn't noticed before. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, slipping around the bases of trunks, pooling in corners that should have been dark. I felt a vibration, subtle at first, like the pulse of the moon itself, threading through the gravel and into the pads of my fingers resting on the log bench. It synced with the flicker, each flash a beat, each fade a quiet exhale. "Mark," Lena's voice trembled. "Look." I turned to see a figure, vague, tall, and impossibly thin, standing beyond the tree line. It was there only in the bright pulse, and vanished with the next dimming. When it returned, it seemed closer, just past the edge of the campsite, its limbs elongated unnaturally. The flickering moon didn't illuminate it so much as reveal it in bursts, like frames from a broken film. Mark's face had gone pale. "That's not possible. That's just..." The sound of distant laughter, or maybe echoes of our own speech, delayed and warped, cut him off. The forest had absorbed our voices and returned them back, lower and distorted, like a hall of mirrors. I flinched. Lena wrapped her arms around herself, shivering even though the night air had grown no colder. Another pulse. This time the figure was closer, and another joined it, emerging from the darkness between flickers. The flickering wasn't consistent anymore. It skipped, stuttered, pulsing in uneven intervals. Every time it faded, the forest seemed to lean in, listening, waiting. I could feel my heartbeat rising, each thump echoing in my ears, and the flicker of the second moon seemed to sync to it. Faster, quicker, a heartbeat amplified into the rhythm of the light. "What the hell is it?" Mark whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the movement, the glimpses of figures and elongated shadows, the way the light warped the ground, bending the familiar shapes of our campsite into something alien. The tents no longer seemed safe, their thin fabric no longer protective. The pulse changed again, becoming more deliberate, a sequence rather than a rhythm, light, dark, long, short. Like a signal, I realized with a sinking dread that it was pointing, or measuring, or marking. Something beneath the campsite was using it, and we had stepped into its radius. Lena grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," she said, voice shaking. "Can't," I said. My own voice sounded strange in the half-light, too loud, too slow. The second moon flickered, and in that brief illumination I could see the shadows shifting across the gravel paths, pointing toward our tents. Not random movement, direction. Intent. The figures beyond the tree line were closer now. Not entirely human, not entirely shadow, but glimpses of both. They moved in a way the human eye should have rejected, appearing and disappearing in the interval of each pulse. When the light went out, I felt them, rather than saw them, pressing against the edges of my vision, the hair at my neck, the very air. Mark tried to stand, but his legs were leaden. "We just need to run," he said, voice tight. The pulse skipped, stuttering, and in that moment, I realized the forest itself was reacting. The trees leaned inward slightly, their branches almost imperceptibly stretching toward the flicker. The gravel underfoot shifted minutely with each flash, forming shallow depressions where none had been. It's counting us," I whispered. The second moon flared violently, brighter than I had imagined possible, and the figures solidified just enough for us to see their faces, or what passed for faces, distorted, impossible, and grinning with awareness. We stumbled backward, tripping over gravel and logs. Lena screamed, and the echo returned warped, a chorus of our own panic, and then was gone. I looked up. The second moon hovered impossibly close, flickering wildly, pulsing in a pattern that seemed to respond directly to our movements. And then I realized the truth. We hadn't noticed it before because we had assumed it was a celestial anomaly. But it was here, part of the campsite, part of the forest. Waiting. Not a moon at all, but a conduit, a measuring device, a sentinel. And with a final flicker, it revealed the entire forest in its false silver light, not the trees we knew, not the gravel pads and posts, but a grid, a map, lines radiating outward from our sight. Pointing and probing and recording. We hadn't chosen to camp here. We had merely stepped into the space it had been preparing. And in the pulse of the dying moonlight, I understood, the forest had been waiting for us. Their tent was surrounded by ropes tied into perfect circles. We had arrived at Site 21 just after sunset, the gravel pad warm underfoot from the fading daylight. The loop was quiet, lined with evenly spaced posts, each numbered and fading with years of weather. Pine needles littered the ground beyond the pad, and the smell of resin mingled with the nylon of our tents as we unpacked. A few other campers were visible at distant sites, their fires tiny glimmers, smoke drifting lazily into the darkening forest. The air was cold but not biting. Crickets trilled steadily, a low and comforting pulse, and the occasional owl called from somewhere beyond the trees. Lena carried our cooler to the fire ring, Mark followed with a bundle of logs, and I adjusted the tent pegs, hammering them firmly into the gravel. It was a calm, ordinary night. The first oddity came with the fire. It burned steadily, but the logs seemed heavier than they should have been, resistant to flame. A faint smell of pine smoke hung, but it was muted, almost artificial. We noticed it only in passing, laughing nervously. "Must be damp wood," Mark said. But the way the shadows shifted, long, thin, and never quite aligning with the flicker of the firelight, made me uneasy. We settled in, cooking a simple meal of beans and rice. The stars were beginning to appear, one by one, above the tall pines. Everything felt normal, yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, as though our little patch of gravel pad had a layer of silence pressed over it. After dinner, we retreated to our tent. I unrolled my sleeping bag while Lena poured hot chocolate into the flasks. Mark leaned against a tree, idly tossing small stones into the fire. Then we noticed the ropes. They had not been there a moment ago. Perfect circles of rope lay neatly around the tent, one slightly larger than the other, each knot meticulously tied. The ends disappeared beneath the gravel and pine needles as though buried, but the loops were complete, precise, and impossibly deliberate. Did one of you put these here?" I asked. Lena shook her head, eyes wide. "No, I haven't touched rope since we unpacked." Mark frowned. "Maybe some prank from another campsite." "Impossible. We were at the end of the loop. The nearest tent was 300 feet away, and there was no way anyone could have moved these ropes here undetected, not with the crunch of gravel underfoot and our fire still burning. I knelt to inspect them. The ropes were dry, stiff, slightly rough against my fingers, but not frayed. They smelled faintly of earth, of something older than the surrounding forest. And when I ran a hand over one of the knots, I felt a vibration, not mechanical, not like a pulse of the ground, but something subtle, almost aware. Lena moved closer to me. "I don't like this," she said. "Something's off." The fire flared briefly, though no wind had stirred. Shadows twisted in the corner of my vision, falling in directions that didn't match the flames. A soft scraping sound came from the tree line, distant, deliberate. We froze. "It's probably just branches," Mark said, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. We tried to rationalize, but the forest itself seemed wrong. The crickets had fallen silent, replaced by a low rustle, like movement just beyond the firelight. I thought I saw figures, slender, fleeting silhouettes, slipping between the trees and the ropes. Each time the fire flickered, the shapes seemed closer, but gone when the light steadied. I stood abruptly. "We should leave." Mark shook his head. "It's just ropes. There's nothing here." But the circles weren't passive. As we moved, the ropes seemed to shift in subtle ways, the knots aligning toward us when we looked away, the loops pressing slightly against the gravel as though adjusting. Lena backed against the tent, her voice trembling. "It's watching us." The sensation intensified. Each step toward the car felt measured, monitored. I noticed the forest breathing in our direction. The wind was absent, but the pine needles seemed to rise slightly, then fall, a slow rhythm perfectly synchronized with the thumping of my pulse. We tried to sleep. The tent walls pressed in unnaturally. Every flap of nylon sounded too loud, every snap of a twig too close. The ropes lay outside, still in perfect circles. And the soft vibrations persisted, subtle, patient, as though they were counting us, or timing us. At some point, I awoke to whispering. Not words, not human speech, but voices too low, too rhythmic to understand. The sound came from outside, yet seemed to emanate from the ropes themselves. They pulsed faintly with each whisper, the knots twisting in ways that defied physics. Shadows moved between the circles, briefly coalescing into forms that mirrored our shapes, then fading with the next subtle flare of the firelight. We couldn't leave. Every attempt to step beyond the ropes caused the loops to tighten imperceptibly, or at least it felt that way. Our perceptions warped, distance misjudged, direction skewed. Time slowed and stretched. A footstep seemed to echo a heartbeat later, a laugh split into two, slightly off. Hours passed in tense stillness. Sleep came in snatches, uneasy and shallow. I dreamt of the ropes tightening, coiling around us, but never constricting, only marking. When dawn arrived, pale and hesitant behind the forest, we dared to step out. The circles remained, perfect, untouched. Yet I realized with a sinking clarity, they hadn't been placed to trap us. They had been placed to mark us. We left Site 21 without looking back, gravel crunching underfoot, tent still standing, ropes still perfect. Behind us, in the still shadows of the tree line, the loops pulsed faintly in the pale light, as though noting our departure, recording our passage. The forest didn't release us. It had only registered that we existed, only that we were counted. And somewhere beyond the trees, the ropes waited for the next visitors.